Introduction. During December 2020, a pro-Trump rally in Taiwan was supported by a crowd of 8,000 people, virtually all local Taiwanese. In contrast, during March 2021, a Stop Anti-Asian Hate and Misogyny march in Taiwan drew just over 100 people at its peak, and many of them were non-Taiwanese foreigners. The fact that Taiwanese support for a campaign against Asian hate comprised only 1.5% of the support for an explicit racist who is outspokenly derogatory to Asian people certainly invites explanation. To introduce this video, I'm going to start by reading you a news report of a scenario which will be all too familiar to anyone who has been following the news in the US for the last half a year. Before I do, I warn you it involves police violence causing the death of an ethnic minority immigrant worker. The report is brief and not graphic, but you should use the timestamp in the video description to skip forward a couple of minutes if you think it might be distressing to hear. I'll now start reading from the news report. Quote, a runaway migrant worker from Vietnam, who was an alleged car thief, was shot at least 6 times and killed by police on Thursday morning. According to local reports, the 27-year-old man jumped out of the small truck and started attacking the officers. One officer was punched in the face, resulting in a fractured nose and heavy bleeding. The officers used batons and pepper spray against the suspect, who flushed his eyes with water and then threw stones at the officers. An officer allegedly warned he would use his firearm. However, the suspect did not stop and was seen dashing to the unoccupied police vehicle and about to drive it off. That prompted the armed officer, who was 5 meters away, to fire shots at him. A preliminary police investigation showed that the suspected thief was a Vietnamese migrant worker who had been on the run for 3 years and allegedly had a history of stealing vehicles. Police did not rule out the possibility that the Vietnamese man may have had a mental illness. End quote. Note the events in this news report and the very specific language used by the reporters to describe them. 1. An unnamed migrant worker labeled a, quote, runaway and, quote, an alleged car thief, end quote, is pursued by police. 2. The worker is said to have attacked police, harming one of them physically. 3. Police then apparently respond with non-lethal force, showing restraint. 4. The worker escalates the situation with even more dangerous violence. 5. Police finally respond by shooting the worker several times, resulting in their death. 6. The worker is further described as having been, quote, on the run for 3 years, end quote, with, quote, a history of stealing cars, end quote. 7. Police imply the worker, quote, may have had a mental illness, end quote. This news report follows the same script seen countless times in the US over the last 6 months. However, in this case, there are several significant differences. The event took place in Taiwan, not the US. The news article was written using information supplied by the local Taiwan police force, and the reporter was a staff member of the Asia Times news network based in Hong Kong. At the time of writing, early April 2021, a social justice campaign called Stop Anti-Asian and Pacific Islander Hate is sweeping across the Western world, prompted by an extraordinary outbreak of violence against Asian people in the United States. Recently, this movement has also been picked up in Taiwan, where it has received widespread publicity. However, in Taiwan, the slogan is typically abbreviated to Stop Anti-Asian Hate, and as it is used in Taiwan, this slogan has a meaning which is quite different to how it is commonly understood in the US. Even as many voices are raised to stop anti-Asian hate, a much smaller but distinctly audible number of Taiwanese voices are questioning what this really means in Taiwan and pointing out an unpleasant hypocrisy which underlines Taiwan's enthusiastic adoption of this call to action. This is the first of 3 videos which will identify and explain the neoliberal socio-economic dysfunction which is ironically being exposed by Taiwan's Stop Anti-Asian Hate campaign, drawing extensively on Taiwanese news reports, social commentary, and academic literature by Taiwanese scholars. This video addresses these topics. One, US anti-Asian hate crimes in Taiwan's media. 2. The Asian versus Asian American empathy gap. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. US anti-Asian hate crimes in Taiwan's media. The recent wave of anti-Asian hate crimes in the US has received immediate notice and publicity in Taiwan. An article in the Taiwan News on the 28th of March 2021 cited, quote, a wave of high-profile and sometimes deadly violence against Asian Americans since the pandemic began, end quote. On the 31st of March 2021, an article on the Focus Taiwan news service said that Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs had issued a statement in condemnation of the recent hate crime wave and, quote, called on Taiwanese nationals in the US to stay alert, end quote. The article cited ministry official Joanne Jiang-an, saying, quote, Taiwan's government has always upheld human rights and has full respect for diversity and tolerance among cultures, end quote, and, quote, urging discrimination targeting Asians to stop, end quote. On March 26, an article in Taiwan's New Bloom magazine, an online publication with a liberal and progressive stance, described a march which took place that day in Taipei, Taiwan's capital, protesting against, quote, anti-Asian racism and misogyny in light of the rise in hate incidents against anti-Asian Americans and Pacific Islands, SIC, in the United States, end quote. The article cited Rachel Lee, one of the organizers, explaining, quote, we marched to raise awareness about the rising racism and misogyny against Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the United States and other parts of the world, end quote. Another activist present, non-binary Taiwanese American Darius Zhang, was quoted saying, quote, here in Taiwan, the Asian American diaspora worries for our family and loved ones abroad, where racialized violence against Asian Americans has risen during the pandemic, end quote. Taiwanese outrage over the recent outbreak of anti-Asian hate crimes in the US can be found across news media and social media, expressing solidarity with the Asian American diaspora. Less commonly cited is the violence against Pacific Islanders, though this is occasionally mentioned. Taiwanese support for Asian Americans and condemnation of hate crimes against them is both understandable and commendable. However, it is also highly ironic in light of certain facts, including Taiwan's enthusiastic support of Donald Trump, who has been instrumental in fanning the flames of division and hatred towards Asian Americans and other ethnic groups. The Asian versus Asian American empathy gap. As I mentioned at the start of this video, during December 2020, a pro-Trump rally in Taiwan was supported by a crowd of 8,000 people, virtually all local Taiwanese. In contrast, during March 2021, a Stop Anti-Asian Hate and Misogyny march in Taiwan drew a little over 100 people at its peak, and many of them were non-Taiwanese foreigners. Later, a video of the Stop Anti-Asian Hate and Misogyny march was uploaded to YouTube. Despite being on the Taiwan News YouTube channel, which has 17,300 subscribers, and being shared on Facebook, the video currently has only 188 views as of the 7th of April 2021, around 10 days after it was uploaded. There are only 6 comments, 3 of which express opposition to the march, written by 2 people who appear to be local Taiwanese. One antagonistic comment reads, quote, is this real? Please consider reviewing how this false narrative to deceive people, women, have been promoted and who will profit. This is fake news, end quote. In response to that, another commenter simply replies, quote, huh, end quote. A third commenter in the same thread then adds, quote, he is correct. This is wrong. It really is fake. China is ready to attack my country, and this is what we are concerned about? Do you have any idea how many people have died at the hands of the CCP? China is using this to separate us. End quote. The same commenter also left another remark on the video, writing, quote, "This is really sad to see. China is winning. Where is the rally for the Uyghurs? Just so gross to see this." End quote. The powerful contrast between enthusiastic Taiwanese support for Trump and the almost non-existent Taiwanese support for the US Stop Anti-Asian Hate campaign certainly invites an explanation. Recently, some heart-searching by progressive commentary in Taiwan has attempted to address this apparent contradiction. On the 28th of March 2021, an article in Taiwan's New Bloom magazine by Nathaniel Zheng, entitled "In the Face of Anti-Asian Racism, Asians and Asian Americans Need to Better Understand Each Other," raised important issues for consideration. His lengthy, detailed, and thoughtful article identified a significant empathy gap between Asian people living in Asia and the Asian diaspora living elsewhere. In particular, he noted, quote, "In Taiwan and China, people often do not grasp the context of the struggles that Asian Americans face," end quote, explaining that issues such as, quote, "Asian American identity, diversity and representation, racism, racial discrimination, and other American domestic political issues have little personal meaning to people in Asia," end quote. Although this would seem to be contradicted by Taiwan's support of the Stop Anti-Asian Hate campaign, there are curious inconsistencies in the way Taiwanese view the US. In October 2020, an article by Luc Sabatier for the Focus Taiwan news service cited a survey indicating 53% of Taiwanese wanted Trump to win the upcoming election, while only 31.5% hoped he would lose. This level of support is significantly higher than the percentage of US voters who elected Trump in 2016. It would be easy to contribute this to Taiwanese conservatism, but the facts indicate otherwise. An article in Taiwan's New Lens media service noted that in Taiwan, support for Trump was largely provided by members of the Democratic Progressive Party, a neoliberal political party which tacitly supports Taiwanese independence and which is typically voted for by Taiwanese progressives. It might seem odd that liberal and progressive Taiwanese would support such a conservative, regressive, divisive, and racist political figure as Trump, but closer inspection demonstrates that this is simply a byproduct of Taiwanese people in Taiwan and the US having very different priorities to other Asian Americans. Taiwanese enthusiasm for Trump is a product of his explicitly anti-China stance, which is typically shared by conservatives, progressives, and liberals in Taiwan, who all view it as important to Taiwan's national security. An editorial in the Taipei Times newspaper on the 31st of March 2021 explained, quote, "Many Taiwanese share Trump's disdain for the Communist Party due to Beijing's constant bullying and threatening behavior," end quote, citing the pro-Trump rally in Taipei during December 2020, which drew 8,000 people. Another article in the Taipei Times on the 20th of December 2020 cited that pro-Trump rally, at which demonstrators carried signs reading, quote, "Taiwan-US cooperation. We support Trump to dispose Communist China," end quote, and, quote, "Taiwan, fight for Trump," end quote, and, quote, "Stop the steal," end quote, and, quote, "Make America great again," end quote. From October to December, Taiwan's social media was increasingly filled with pro-Trump propaganda. However, an article in the Taipei Times on the 29th of October 2020 noted that this was not confined to Taiwanese in Taiwan, citing, quote, "Trump supporters in and outside Taiwan who believe the election of the Democrat candidate would spell disaster for Taiwan," end quote. The article went on to say that, quote, "Taiwanese and Taiwanese Americans have been increasingly vocal, with several posting links to pro-Trump Facebook groups, one with over 2,800 members," end quote. This article noted that polls, quote, "showed Taiwan as the only country among 15 in Europe and Asia where support for Trump outweighed that for Biden," end quote, citing 42% of Taiwanese respondents supporting Trump and only 30% supporting Biden. The article also noted, quote, "With the exception of Taiwan and Vietnam, many Asia countries would vote for Joe Biden," end quote. The article quoted interviews with a range of Taiwanese American Trump supporters, most of whom cited Trump's anti-China stance and his pro-business politics as more important to them than his racist outbursts. Another Taiwanese American was quoted explaining that Kamala Harris, Joe Biden's running mate, was not well thought of by either himself or his Taiwanese peers, quote, because she supposedly favored the African American community more than the Asian community, end quote. So Taiwanese support for Trump is largely motivated by geopolitical concerns, which, for Taiwanese, are far more important than Trump's own racist rhetoric. Writing in the online news service The Diplomat on the 17th of November 2020, Yan Ian Zhong observed that support for Trump in Taiwan and Hong Kong, quote, appears surprising at first blush, end quote, given that the same people, quote, also claim to oppose authoritarianism, support democratic practices such as the rule of law, and would even be likely targets for white supremacists, end quote. Zhong writes that, quote, part of the view about Trump's toughness comes from a broader assumption that Republicans are generally strong on China and Democrats weaker, end quote. In addition to this, there is also the fact that Taiwan has been strongly anti-communist ever since it was invaded and taken over by the Chinese Nationalist Party and its army in 1949, and is under constant explicit threat of invasion by China, a nuclear superpower just 180 kilometers away. Given that leftists in Europe and the US typically support China over the West and China over Taiwan, it is unsurprising that Taiwan finds few allies within leftist circles. Consequently, Taiwanese people tend to gravitate to right-wing Western political figures and parties. It is not that Taiwanese people are ignorant of Trump's racist attitudes and behavior. The Taipei Times editorial on the 31st of March 2021 notes that Trump's, quote, anti-Chinese rhetoric, end quote, and, quote, generally divisive and inflammatory behavior, end quote, has resulted in, quote, a tragic situation that affects not only Chinese, but all Asians in the US, including Taiwanese and Taiwanese Americans, end quote. While acknowledging that, quote, the US is an important ally as Taiwan resists Chinese aggression, and people are free to voice their support for Trump, end quote, the editorial appealed to Taiwanese people to, quote, look at the whole picture and not turn a blind eye to the fruits of Trump's administration, especially when their overseas compatriots and loved ones might be affected, end quote. However, it is easy for people in Taiwan to overlook Trump's racism, since even his worst outbursts do not affect them personally. To Taiwanese in Taiwan, anti-Asian hate is a peculiarly United States problem which doesn't exist elsewhere and certainly has no relevance to them. This is reflected in the Taipei Times editorial's observation that, quote, only a fraction of the number who marched in the pro-Trump events took part in the anti-Asian racism rally on Sunday, end quote. The editorial also noted that many who did attend the anti-Asian racism rally, quote, were Taiwanese Americans or foreign residents, end quote. Let's now return to Nathaniel Zheng's article about the lack of understanding between what he calls Asians and Asian Americans. Zheng writes that according to Chinese and Taiwanese students he interviewed, quote, people back home have seen the explosion of violence against the Asian American Pacific Islander community in the United States as shocking yet distant, end quote. Zheng attributes this in part to Chinese language media reporting on Asian Americans, which he says, quote, is often limited to either glowing reports of successful Chinese Americans or contrasting reports of rampant discrimination, end quote. Still, he also notes, quote, many Chinese Americans have a superficial grasp of society and politics in China and Taiwan, end quote, and says they are consequently, quote, unaware of or apathetic to many of the ordinary, everyday societal and political issues that affect the daily lives of people in China or Taiwan, end quote. In Zheng's view, to many Chinese Americans, quote, even high-profile issues such as human rights, civil society, the crackdown in Hong Kong, or Taiwan's fear of Chinese hegemonic influence remain unfamiliar and impersonal, end quote. While rightly condemning Trump, Zheng makes the important point that Trump is not the only source of anti-Asian hate in the US, nor in the West itself, citing, quote, the perceived demonization and overwhelming negative coverage of China in Western media as a cause of anti-Asian racism, end quote. Nevertheless, even here, Zheng advises caution, saying, quote, "There is a difference, however, between legitimate critical reporting on China's human rights abuses or regional irredentism and irresponsible, unfounded, racist rhetoric," end quote. He also pushes back against the view that, quote, "any negative coverage of China is therefore somehow inherently xenophobic and merely anti-Chinese propaganda," end quote. Zheng's views will find little sympathy among many leftists, but they are important to understand if we are to understand the complexities of what Stop Anti-Asian Hate actually means in Taiwan. Another important article in Taiwan's New Bloom magazine, written by Daniel Yoling Chen on the 26th of March 2021, raises an additional topic for consideration: the curious fact that many Asian people, both in Asia and in the United States, are unsupportive of hate crime legislation. Chen quotes Dr. Liu Wen, assistant researcher at Academia Sinica, Taiwan's National Academy. Given the fact that Wen's research is based on critical race and queer theory and largely concerns global capitalism, neo-imperialism, decolonization, black feminism, queer criticism, and the dangers of neoliberalism, it might seem surprising to find that Wen is not in favor of hate crime legislation. As quoted by Chen, Wen says, quote, "I know a lot of people are calling for hate crime legislation, but if you look at the history, hate crimes are never preventative. They are always about increasing punishment, increasing police. In that way, if we demand that hate crime legislation, Asian American movements or global Asian movements are going to be farther away from other people of color who are struggling to end police violence," end quote. Chen then offers his own perspective, noting that, quote, "the utility or futility of hate crime legislation and carceral thinking among Asian Americans has been the subject of much conversation in recent months in the United States," end quote. Speaking of the march against anti-Asian racism and misogyny in Taipei in March 2021, Chen added, quote, "these tensions could also be seen across the Pacific here in Taipei this morning," end quote. Similarly, a 200-page PhD thesis published in 2020 by Taiwanese scholar Yen Shangzheng of the Mora School of Law at Indiana University wrestles with the legal and ethical challenges of implementing hate speech legislation in Taiwan, which, Zhang notes, quote, "has no law specifically for hate speech," end quote. Zhang takes note of Taiwan's oppressive history under a 50-year military dictatorship and Taiwanese pride in their relatively recently built democracy, citing these as contributing facts to Taiwanese hesitancy to enact speech restriction legislation. She also argues that a general hate crime law will, quote, "fix or alleviate most hate speech issues in Taiwan," end quote. Nevertheless, she also suggests, quote, "hate speech laws for protecting some specific groups which are discrete, insular, under historical oppression, and frequently excluded from the marketplace of ideas," end quote. Further recommending, quote, "using the limitation of speech for speech immediately inciting violence," end quote. Concern about the possible harmful implications of hate speech legislation is not confined to progressives in Taiwan. An article by Professor Hishori Fukurai and Professor Alice Yang, entitled "The History of Japanese Racism, Japanese American Redress, and the Dangers Associated with Government Regulation of Hate Speech," published in 2018, argues that, quote, "trusting and empowering the government to define hate speech can be potentially dangerous and may even harm people's right to free speech, including criticisms of racialized government policies," end quote. It is worth noting that Japan suffered under an oppressive military dictatorship for almost the same amount of time as Taiwan, and this may contribute to Japan's lack of enthusiasm for hate speech legislation, especially if it is seen as a potential weapon with which governments could restrict free speech. Conclusion. This video has provided an explanation of the differing perspectives of Taiwanese and other Asian people in Asia and their diaspora counterparts in the United States. It explains why a pro-Trump rally in Taiwan in December 2020 was supported by a crowd of 8,000 people, while a Stop Anti-Asian Hate and Misogyny march in Taiwan in March 2021 drew a little over 100 people at its peak. However, there is another issue in Taiwan's social environment which must also be addressed if we are to understand properly why Stop Anti-Asian Hate is a hypocritical rallying cry in Taiwan. This will be addressed in the second video in this series.